Distinguished guests, members of the Consular Corps, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute this evening for a discussion of the life and legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. Secretary Baker and I both worked with Prime Minister Rabin and have known Ambassador Rabinovich for many years, a close friend. We are delighted to have the ambassador here with his wife, Efrat, for this special event. You have Itamar's biography in your program, a very illustrious career that I refer you to. After Secretary Baker's remarks, Ambassador Rabinovich and I will discuss his book and take some questions from the audience. Baker Institute staff will be distributing and collecting question cards, so please fill those out. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary James A. Baker.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to echo Ambassador Yerigin's welcome to all of you to the Baker Institute. Let me say to you that our guest tonight played an extraordinarily key role during a critical period in the early 1990s when Israelis came extraordinarily close to striking peace with their Arab neighbors. Sadly, that moment of hope ended in 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, was assassinated by an Israeli who opposed his peace efforts. Yitzhak Rabin was a truly courageous peacemaker. Had he lived, there was a very good chance that he could have struck a bargain with Palestinians, something that would have changed Middle Eastern and world history forever. Since then, sadly, recapturing the momentum of that moment has remained elusive and very elusive. Now, 22 years after Yitzhak Rabin's tragic assassination, our speaker has written a comprehensive biography about him, one that is very worthy of this historic figure. The book, Yitzhak Rabin, Soldier, Leader, and Statesman, examines the late Prime Minister through the eyes of our guest, who was at Rabin's side during key moments in their country's history. The biography paints a very full picture of Rabin, who grew from a mellow child into a strong-willed leader of Israel, from an awkward politician into a statesman, and from a soldier into a dedicated peacemaker. Over time, Yitzhak and I became very good friends, and he and his wife Leah hosted me and Susan as guests of the government of Israel after I left office as Secretary of State. As a result, I look forward to his dialogue today with Ambassador Edward Yerigin. While promoting the book, our guest was asked a question by a television commentator. How can we best achieve Yitzhak Rabin's vision of peace and security? He didn't respond as you might expect. He didn't outline ways to reach a two-state solution or frame the international discussions that would be needed to achieve it. Nor did he talk about the political forces inside Israel and the United States that shaped the peace process. Instead, our guest tonight paused for a moment and said simply, the way to do that is by having good people go into politics. The challenge, he went on, is to make politics attractive again to good people who will provide good leadership. This is a lesson that all of us, Israelis and Americans alike, should take to heart in these very troubled times. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce tonight's guest. He is a dedicated diplomat who was Israel's ambassador to the United States. He is a steadfast proponent for peace. He is a distinguished scholar and a brilliant biographer who now heads the Israel Institute. But most of all, he is, like Yitzhak Rabin, a good man who understands the meaning of true leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich.
Thank you so much.
Ambassador Rabinovich's book will be available for sale and signing at the end of our discussion. Well, Itamar, it's really such a delight to have you here, as Secretary Baker has noted. This is a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's very, not only informative, but it's very inspiring. Can you give us a little sense of Yitzhak Rabin's character? Because you've titled the book Soldier, Leader, Statesman, three very important characteristics. We all know, in dealing with him, he had a shyness about him, and yet at the same time he was a man of steel.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to first of all thank Secretary Baker for your very kind words. I followed his career as an academic before I myself became a practitioner, and had too short an opportunity to work with him at the end of '92 when I became Rabin's negotiator with Syria, and have always admired his ability to identify the core of an issue, to figure out how to get to the core and go about it effectively. So he's been almost unique in that capacity, and I really appreciated being here and hearing what you had to say about me. And Ed, of course, I got to know Ed when we began to work together in the peace process of the 1990s, which he shepherded for the State Department, and then he and Françoise as ambassador and his spouse in Israel, and we've retained our friendship. It's not my first visit to the Baker Institute, and my wife and I are delighted to be here again. So let me now respond to Ambassador Georgian's question. Rabin's character evolved over time. I must mention his mother, who was the greatest influence on his character. His name is Rosa. Her nickname in Tel Aviv was Red Rosa because she was a firebrand. A Russian revolutionary, not a Zionist originally, who ended up in Palestine in 1919 and then became a Zionist. A very strong-willed woman, Spartan in her ways. She was active, but she hated political activity, and I think you're beginning to recognize the influence. So her son began as a very shy boy. As a biographer, I had access through the family to family letters, and was surprised to find out that he was a very good letter writer in his teens, very open with his father, sister, and friends, and spoke openly about his shyness. And he was shy, introverted, sometimes awkward with people. Absolutely not what you expect of a politician. He didn't like pressing the flesh, making phone calls to party activists in party branches, spending time in idle small talk. It was always businesslike. But one of my arguments in the book is that what made him an awkward politician actually helped make him a very successful leader and statesman. He was very honest, straightforward, sometimes blunt. American presidents and secretaries of state who dealt with him appreciated the bluntness and the integrity. Obviously, the president or the secretary of state always want to hear a yes, but they can appreciate a no when a no is meant, rather than a yes but or a yes that is not implemented. He could be very tough, rough exterior, but it really covered that shy, much more mellow individual. He demanded from people who worked for him like me absolute loyalty, but he also gave absolute loyalty. When he said something, it was etched in stone. He was tough to his immediate subordinates, but very soft with simple soldiers and junior officers. When he, as general, chief of staff, minister of defense, or prime minister used to go to the field. He would talk to the simple soldiers and find out what was really happening. He was very good about that. He had the unusual ability to see the large picture and master the details. He had a photographic memory and paid a great attention to detail. Was very careful. And I'll end this response with one illustration. The famous operation in Entebbe, when Israel raided the airport in Uganda and saved the hijacked passengers who were hijacked to Uganda. This was a very risky operation to send Israeli airplanes thousands of miles away with the elite units of the IDF and to risk the lives of these soldiers and officers and of the hostages. Rabin was the prime minister, Shimon Peres was the defense minister. The defense minister, once he saw a plan realistically laid on the table, began to push for it, and the prime minister said, no, I want to be 100% sure, to the last moment. And it was only at the last moment that he became absolutely confident that this was going to work. And then he did something typical for Rabin. He left a letter of resignation with his chief of staff and said, if it fails, use it.
Fascinating. There's so much to cover. I know we have very brief time, but you have one part of your book, the first tenure of Rabin's prime ministership in 1974, you just refer, and the experience of failure, because there were failures during that first administration. As you said, there was the Sebastia affair, the Gush Emamim, the settlers movement. And can you sort of characterize the lessons he learned? Because I think in leadership, if you are a true leader, you're going to fail in your life because you're going to be taking risks. But to get up from failure and to proceed, but I think that was one of the key messages of your book.
Yeah, I define Rabin's first tenure was 1974 to 1977. And I define it as a policy success, political failure. Policy success because Israel was in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, thousands of casualties, damage to the IDF, damage to the economy. And as the prime minister, he rebuilt the IDF, he began to rebuild the economy, put the country on track again. And secondly, he did sign the interim agreement on the Sinai in 1975 with Sadat through the mediation of Henry Kissinger that laid the basis for the 1977 Sadat trip to Jerusalem and to Egyptian-Israeli peace. So there were significant achievements in that tenure, but politically there were a number of problems. One, he was not prepared for the office. In fact, when he became prime minister, he did not expect to become prime minister. After he was the victorious chief of staff in the Six-Day War, he asked to go to Washington as ambassador because he wanted to prepare himself for a political career and was a very good ambassador. He came back and was about to run in the Labour Party list for the elections and to become a junior minister in the government. But then the fiasco of the October War came, and eventually Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan had to resign in '74, and the party had to choose a replacement. And they decided on Rabin because he had impeccable credentials. He was the victorious chief of staff of '67. He was not tainted by the failure of '73. He was not in office. And so he was elected by the party, only barely so in a competition with Shimon Peres. So he was absolutely ill-prepared for that. Second, the rivalry with Shimon Peres, which was the bane of that tenure. And he also still lived in the shadow of Golda Meir and the party elders who elected him for office. And all told, it was not a good term. Now, 15 years later, he was given a rare gift, a second opportunity after having to resign in 77. He became Prime Minister again in 92. And that's a key to understand some of his courageous decisions in the second tenure, because he was determined that he was going to use this rare opportunity to achieve something meaningful. He was not given by the Almighty or whoever gives these opportunities a second chance just to enjoy the trappings of power such as they are for an Israeli Prime Minister. You were ambassador in Israel, you know it's not an easy job, but he knew that he was there for a purpose, and he was determined to use it to really change Israel's agenda.
I think you're brilliant. You state in your book that failed leaders are rarely given a second chance, and Rabin was to be no exception. But he did establish his leadership position for himself in the Labour Party, and this image he had of Mr. Security must have been essential to that.
Right. Actually, the trajectory of Rabin's career is very interesting. Rabin had no natural charisma. He was not Moshe Dayan, he was not Yigal Allon, he was not Ehud Barak. You know, all these, the other three that I mentioned, when they were 20 years old, everybody knew that they were going to go to the top. They radiated this charisma, which Rabin did not. So Rabin developed incrementally, and his ambition was developed incrementally. When he was a major, he wanted to be a colonel. When he was a colonel, he wanted to be a general. Then he wanted to be chief of staff. Then he wanted to be ambassador. Then he wanted to be a minister. And then he became a prime minister. So it developed gradually. And with it, skills came. He understood that one lesson from the first term is that if you want to be in politics, you have to play the game. So he did not become a backslapper, but he became more accessible to party members. He improved his eloquence. He became a better public speaker. He learned how to deal with television and other media. He definitely was a much better politician. But what was more important, when he was Minister of Defense in the 1980s, for 6 years in national unity governments, he became Mr. National Security. The public accepted, while he did not have charisma, he had authority, and he had credibility. For instance, let's say that in the late 80s, when he was Minister of Defense, there would be an incident on the Lebanese border, and 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers were killed. He would appear on television, would look the audience straight to television and say, I am the Minister of Defense, and as such, the responsibility is mine. Not common commodity in politics, but these were, and I don't think that was an affected trick. That was the man. And so the combination of authority and integrity was what established his authority with the Israeli public. In 92, he was given the Labour Party nomination because the party apparatus, rank and file, became persuaded that Shimon Peres could not win an election in Israel, and that Rabin, because he was centrist and because he was popular, could, and he was given that second chance.
You mentioned also that the first Intifada started in December 1987 was a cause of radical change in Rabin's outlook and policy. Could you just very briefly tell how that shaped the future course of Israeli politics, as you mentioned?
Yeah, what happened in December 87, when the first Intifada broke out, it was a popular rebellion, a spontaneous popular rebellion. Until that, for 20 years, Israel could rule the West Bank and Gaza at a very small cost, actually. There was terrorism, but there was no popular insurrection. Once there was a popular insurrection, it meant that Israeli soldiers had to chase after children in the alleys of the Kasbahs and to actually repress a popular insurrection. That was a price the Israeli public was not willing to pay, and that actually even Prime Minister Shamir was very hawkish. Did go to the Madrid conference in the shadow of the Intifada. That that had an impact even on the Israeli right wing.
You discuss, in a very important part of your book, Rabin's peace policy. You mentioned 1992, 1995, when he was assassinated, and that in his second term as prime minister, he evolved into statesmanship, and that his legacy is shaped by his peace policy and his second tenure, and the very bold decisions he took on Palestinian and Syrian negotiating tracks. Can you just generally describe this really dramatic transition in the man?
Yeah, prior to being elected in 1992, Rabin publicly said that Israel should not come off the Golan Heights, and he definitely he bedeviled Yasser Arafat personally and the PLO. When he became prime minister and decided that he had to change Israel's realities, he had to change Israel's realities because he identified that the major danger to Israel then and now is not from our immediate neighbors, but from the east, Iran, and at the time, Iraq. And his strategic idea was that you have to sort out our immediate environment in order to be able to deal with these two major threats from the east. And obviously, if you had to make peace with Syria and the Palestinians, you also had to make concessions. And the prime minister decided that he was willing to make these concessions. So the great brave decision was the willingness to make the concessions. Actually, and he's remembered very much because of Oslo, but the decision, the willingness to withdraw also from the Golan Heights in order to make peace with Syria, if that was possible, was not less far-reaching for him. Remember, he was a chief of staff in '67 that was basically started off by Syria. He was general officer commanding of the Northern Command, having to defend against fire from the Golan Heights. So for him to make the decision that if peace with Syria were available, he would be willing to get off the Golan Heights, was as startling as Oslo.
Why don't you recount to our audience here when Rabin appointed you as his man for the Israeli-Syrian negotiations and what he told you about what Secretary Baker told him?
Okay. So two parts to that episode. So a couple of weeks after Rabin became prime minister in 1992, he invited me to his home for a meeting on a Saturday, and I didn't know what he had in mind. I thought it might be one of two, either his ambassador in Washington or chief negotiator with Syria. As I mentioned, Rabin was not fond of small talk, so as soon as I came in, he went into business. And he said to me, so my most pressing problem, I need to replace my chief negotiator with Syria. And he said, can you recommend someone who knows Syria and has public standing in the country? Well, what could I do? I mean, say I recommend myself. So I said, maybe I could think of a couple of names. He said, I'm not interested in a couple of names. So
you imitate his voice very well.
So I said, I'd be delighted to do it. And he said, oh, I'm so relieved. And then we went into business. Now here we come to an interesting point, how he gave me my brief. I would say Prime Minister Rabin had a very good working relationship when he was Minister of Defense, and Secretary Baker was Secretary of State. Together they tried in the late 80s to revive the autonomy talks with the Palestinians. And as you will recall, Secretary Baker was asked by President Bush to come back to the White House as Chief of Staff to salvage his campaign against Bill Clinton. But he did make one final tour in the Middle East, and he came to Jerusalem after he was in Damascus. So Rabin said to me, so Secretary Baker was here, and he told me that Assad is willing to make the kind of peace that Sadat had made with Israel, and that the Bush administration, President Bush and Secretary Baker himself would be willing to underwrite such a deal. So the new task is to find out whether this is feasible, which was very interesting because it was his way of telling me that this was a very serious proposition, but secondly, he was also implying to me how far he was willing to go. In the relationship between the head of state or the head of government and the negotiator, the head of government doesn't always tell the negotiator how far he or we is willing to go. But that was his way of implying to me that he was willing to go the distance. And eventually, at some point in the summer of 1993, he did go the distance.
You got really close on the Israeli-Syrian negotiations and the famous Rabin deposit that he gave in the Clinton administration to Secretary of State Christopher. A lot of narratives about that, but in many ways it wasn't handled very well from Rabin's point of view.
That is correct. So, you know, that takes me to, I think, the most dramatic moment in my working life, at least. There was a problem in the negotiations with Assad. Assad may have been willing to make peace, but he was not easy about it. So that's the father, not the current Assad. His line in the negotiations was, yes, I'm willing to make peace, but I will not tell you what kind of peace I'm willing to make before you commit to full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. Our position was, we are not telling you that we'll never do it, but you don't begin a negotiation with the bottom line. You have to begin elsewhere, and you may or may not get to the bottom line. And we got stuck with this. I mean, we did make, Ambassador Georgian was very much part of that effort. We did make significant progress, but we could not get beyond a certain point. At the same time, the Oslo negotiations took place, and by August 1993, the shape of the Oslo Accord was evident, and Rabin had to make a choice. Would he finally endorse Oslo fully or not? He preferred all along a Syrian deal. He preferred a Syrian deal because the Israeli-Syrian conflict is more simple. It's not a national conflict. It's basically a territorial conflict now. Syria was, at that time, it sounds tragic to say it now, at that time was a powerful country, very coherent, under an authoritative ruler. You could, and somebody who was difficult to negotiate, but somebody who was had a very good record of keeping his word. And the Palestinians were not a country, they were a community. They were led by a peculiar national leader. You could not fully trust him. And it was better to start the peace process in a Syrian deal. He preferred that. But how do you break the logjam? So in early August 1993, Secretary Christopher came to Israel, and he was going to proceed to Damascus the next day. And he came to a meeting. Now, normally in meetings between heads of government, there is a small meeting and a larger meeting. A small meeting is never one-on-one because there has to be a note-taker on each side, and then there are 6 or 7 on each side. So in the small meeting was Secretary Christopher, Dennis Ross, Prime Minister Rabin, and myself. And Rabin threw a bombshell. He said to Secretary Christopher, tomorrow, when you go to Damascus, ask Assad, if he gets what he wants, will he give me what I want? Which is known in diplomacy as the hypothetical question technique, which is a technique for breaking deadlocks in negotiations. And then he proceeded to describe a full-fledged deal, predicated on the Egyptian-Israeli peace. And he said to Christopher two things. He said, one, this is absolutely secret, and if word leaks out, it's non-existent. And number two, remember, and he repeated that 3 times, it's in your pocket. It must not be on the table. By which he meant that another Secretary of State, who will remain nameless, would have gone to Damascus with a deposit, would probably have said to Assad, you know, I was in Jerusalem yesterday, I met with Rabin, and I'm beginning to see the crack of a change, so maybe you give me something and I'll go back to Jerusalem, and you shuttle 2 or 3 weeks, and the deal could have been made then. Unfortunately, what seems to have been the case, I was not in the room in Damascus, is that the deposit was simply laid on the table, and of course, you know, the bazaar was born in Damascus. Assad began to say, in principle, yes, but. He said, not withdrawal in 5 years, in 6 months, security arrangements, I need them because I'm the victim, I don't like the word normalization, and you know, the whole litany. And when Secretary Christopher came back to Jerusalem, Rabin understood that this was not very well handled, and on top of that, the American delegation decided to go back to America because it was August and it was vacation time. So I'm not making this up, believe me. So it was missed, and Rabin decided to go to Oslo. My wife and I last night in New York saw the play Oslo, which is now played at the Lincoln Center. I'm going to write a review, and it's not going to be very positive, but among other things, I'm going to say in the review, and just have to remember that but for a failure of policy, Oslo would not have happened.
I know, Itamar, that you're asked, we're often asked the hypothetical question that had Israel and Syria concluded a peace agreement and Israel withdrew from the Golan Heights, wouldn't Israel's security be highly threatened by the current and tragic situation today? How do you answer that?
Yeah, you know, I'm quite often on the media in Israel and speaking every so often about what was going on in Syria. And then journalists like to taunt me with the question, imagine that your negotiation would have succeeded and we would have been off the Golan Heights, how would it be to have ISIS on the Golan Heights? My answer to that is, if Syria had made a deal with us in the 1990s, there would be no Syrian rebellion in 2011. Because Syria was a pressure cooker, as you know very well as a former ambassador. It's a country dominated by a minority, the Alawites. There was a lot of unhappiness with corruption and tyranny and so forth. And making peace with Israel would not have been making peace with just Israel. It would have been peace with Washington and Jerusalem. And it would have meant opening up. Opening up would have released the pressure cooker, and what burst out in 2011 would not have burst out. So had Syria made peace with us, there would be no ISIS altogether.
In the epilogue of your book, you talk about of course this is in the background of Oslo II and the Golan settlers movement, the settlers movement in opposition to Oslo, and you talk and analyze, I think, very critically accurately the incitement that was affecting Israeli politics at that time, that period. And you state that Rabin's assassination looms as an important landmark in Israel's journey toward the right and away from a genuine quest for a two-state solution. And even that they were at the really fringes of Israeli society, like the Kahane movement, they were seeking to replace the state of Israel with what is called the Kingdom of Israel. And this seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the basic, if you will, theoretical divisions in Israel today that is manifesting itself in various aspects. Do you wish to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the assassination of Rabin was a turning point in two respects. One, it was a deadly blow to the peace process. But perhaps even more important, it was an opening of the floodgates in Israeli domestic politics. Now, I must explain something about the settler movement. The settler movement is not a political movement, it's a messianic movement. The core of the settlers, not everybody who bought an apartment in the West Bank, but the core of the settler movement believed that 1967 was a messianic moment. Israel faced a great danger in the crisis of May 67, and divine hand intervened. Israel was saved, had a spectacular victory. That was an omen. And from that point on, they believed that it is their duty as the young Orthodox to continue the Zionist revolution by building on the existing boundaries of Israel and adding on the West Bank, which is the ancestral homeland. After all, Tel Aviv is in the land of the Philistines. The real land of the Bible is in the West Bank. And for good or bad, it is a messianic movement. And for these individuals, some of them, and some of their rabbis, Yitzhak Rabin, or anyone who was willing to give away part of the Holy Land, was a traitor and punishable by death. And there were rabbis who issued opinions, religious opinions, authorizing the killing of Rabin, rabbis in Israel and in the United States, Orthodox rabbis. Now, there was no need to lay a blame on the whole Zionist Orthodox movement, definitely not, and not on the whole leadership of the settlers, because the mainstream of the settler movement can be quite responsible, but this was a fringe. Unfortunately, what did not happen after the assassination were two things. The government did not severely deal with the inciters because it wanted to unify rather than punish. And secondly, the Orthodox movement did not go through the soul searching that it should have gone to, not fully. To date, children from Orthodox schools do not come to the Rabin Center. It remains an open issue and an open wound. So and therefore, as you said, the Kahana people or people who believe in restoring some kind of a Jewish monarchy and so forth, these fringes became much too prominent for my taste and the taste of most Israelis.
This will be my last question to you, then we have a couple of questions from the audience. But you state in the conclusion that Rabin's success continues today to illustrate a crucial aspect of Israel's current politics, that an effective peace policy can be waged by a credible centrist leader with security credentials. Where is that credible centrist leader with security credentials in today's Israel?
We are looking for. I would say we are looking for her. Now, you know, in 1977 we had the first transfer of power in Israel after 30 years of Israeli statehood and about 50 years of pre-state Israeli history. Power shifted from the labor to the right wing. And since 1977, Labor was able to win elections only twice, fully. With Rabin and with Ehud Barak, another centrist former chief of staff of the IDF. Because Israeli public, and even more so in recent years, you know, when you count how many missiles are now pointed at Israel from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iran, you look at the prospect of Iranian nuclear weapon, you look at ISIS, you look at the collapse of so many states around us, people are worried. And when people are worried, they tend to shift to the right. And therefore, the only leader who can win an election is somebody who imbues the people with a sense of confidence and security. It doesn't have to be a former military. You know, Bibi Netanyahu he was a captain, but he was not a general. Menachem Begin was maybe a sergeant in the Polish army. You don't have to be a general in order to send the sense that you are Mr. National Security, but Mr. or Mrs. National Security absolutely absent in today's Israeli politics.
We have several questions about your views on the current political atmosphere and what the prospects of a two-state solution are to move forward.
I think that right now the prospects of a two-state solution are dim. This is not the view of the current Israeli Prime Minister. You have a weak Palestinian leader, and you have an American administration whose policy has yet to become clear, preceded by an administration that basically pivoted away from the Middle East. That was the term, the pivot. Pivoted from the Middle East, the kind of active diplomacy backed by willingness to invest, not just economically, but also militarily if needed, that enabled previous administrations to be responsible for achievements in Arab-Israeli or Middle Eastern peace, is not available now. And I said the parties themselves are not in a mood and mode for this. But this does not mean that we have to abandon everything. I think that it's imperative now to take steps that will keep the option of a two-state solution open. I think there are many, many steps that can make life better for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza that Israel can take, without too much risk to itself, with a huge improvement in its own diplomatic standing and standing in public opinion. And several Israeli think tanks that I know are actually preparing concrete, specific plans as to what can be done in these times.
There's much talk about this outside-in concept that the Palestinian issue is really no longer central as it was in the past, and that what's important is that there's commonality between Israel and Arab Sunni states because of the Iranian threat. You mentioned Rabin's whole approach was you got to deal with the periphery. At his time, Iraq, Iran as major threats from the outside. But today, the Iraqi threat isn't there, the Iranian threat is there. And do you think it's feasible to have an outside-in approach, or does the Palestinian issue still mean, is it still important enough where it has to be addressed by the Israeli leadership?
Without addressing the Palestinian issue, you can have what we have now, a very good security cooperation with Egypt, Jordan, and several Gulf states and North African states. But this is all under the table. A little bit over the table, I mean, we have peace and diplomatic relations with Egypt and Jordan. We are now selling gas to Jordan. We provide water to Jordan and, of course, the Palestinian Authority. And Saudis and other Gulfis are willing to do publicly things they were not willing to do before, to appear with Israeli diplomats on the same panel, and so forth and so forth. But basically, it's all under the table. Now, they don't expect the Palestinian issue to be solved. They know it cannot be resolved right now, but they want to see progress. And if Israel wants to move up or to upgrade its relations with the Sunni states, that's one more consideration for restarting some progress on the Palestinian track.
You know, we could go on for another hour, but I have to conclude it here, unfortunately. The ambassador is available to sign books here. All of you who are interested in so doing, the ambassador will be here, and the book we'll have the books here. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Rabinovich for his presentation.